They called them devil dogs. Not as a compliment, not as the kind of nickname soldiers give to a respected adversary in the abstract warmth of peacetime memory. They called them devil dogs in the mud and the blood and the darkness, while the jungle burned around them, while their own men were dying, while every tactical certainty they had carried across 10,000 miles of Pacific Ocean was dissolving in the wet heat of islands they had been told would fall in days. The word they used, kichiku, was not a military designation. It was an exorcism, something you whisper about a force that does not behave according to the rules of human endurance. This is not a story about American mythology. America already has enough of those. This is a story about what happens when the mythology turns out to be insufficient, when the legend undersells the reality. Because the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army were not fools. They were not untrained. They were not men who broke at the first sign of resistance. They had swept across Asia. They had taken Singapore in 70 days, a fortress the British had called impregnable. They had driven the Americans out of the Philippines. They had built, in the space of 6 months, an empire that stretched from Burma to the edges of Alaska. When these men described the United States Marines as something beyond human, they were not being poetic. They were being precise. The story begins not with a landing, not with a beachhead, not with the famous images of flags being raised over shattered terrain. It begins with a question that Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo was asking itself in the summer of 1942. The question was, who exactly are these people? Not the American army, which Japan had studied and fought and understood to be a conventional force that would respond to conventional pressures. But this other branch, this corps, these men who had been arriving in the Pacific theater in numbers that were beginning to concern the planners. Who were they? What were their limits? The answer would come from Guadalcanal, and it would arrive in a form that Tokyo had not anticipated. In August of 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on a small, sweltering island in the Solomon Chain. The Japanese garrison defending the half-finished airstrip there did not believe the Marines would be able to hold what they seized. This was not arrogance. It was based on an entirely reasonable reading of the situation. The Marines had landed with insufficient supplies. They were cut off almost immediately by a catastrophic naval defeat that sank 4 Allied cruisers in less than 40 minutes. The jungle was a biological nightmare of malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections that ate through skin and boots alike. The Japanese counterattack, when it came, would be coordinated, experienced, and overwhelming. Except that it was not overwhelming, and the men who survived it were left to explain why. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki commanded the first major Japanese counterattack on Guadalcanal on the night of the 21st of August 1942. He led 900 men in a direct assault across a sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River against what his intelligence had told him was a demoralized, undersupplied force that would crack under pressure. Ichiki had fought in China. He had fought in the Philippines. He believed, as imperial doctrine taught, that spiritual intensity could overcome material disadvantage. Against the Marines on that sandbar, in that night, it did not work. The Marines killed more than 800 of his 900 men. Ichiki himself destroyed his regiment's colors and committed suicide rather than report to his commanders. One of his surviving lieutenants, recovered from the jungle 3 weeks later, gave a statement to his superiors that was remarkable in its honesty. He said, "They did not retreat when they should have retreated. They fought from positions no military logic would have chosen. They seemed to find our determination to die in battle amusing rather than terrifying." That last phrase, amusing rather than terrifying, lodged itself in the minds of Japanese planners. It would return again and again in the testimonials that followed over the next 3 years. The Marines' apparent indifference to tactics built around the acceptance of death. Their refusal to be demoralized by situations that would have demoralized other forces. This was not recklessness. It was something more unsettling. It was competence so deeply embedded that it had become instinct. To understand what the Japanese were encountering, you have to understand what the Marine Corps actually was by 1942. What it had been forced to become by 2 decades of institutional warfare over its own existence. The Marine Corps had nearly been abolished after the First World War. The Army considered it redundant. Congress considered it expensive. The Corps had survived by finding a mission no one else wanted, the seizure of fortified Pacific islands against determined resistance. The doctrine they developed, later called amphibious assault doctrine, was at the time of its development purely theoretical, because no one had ever successfully executed a large-scale amphibious assault against a defended shore in the modern era. Gallipoli had been a catastrophe. The conventional wisdom was that such operations were impossible. The Marines spent the 1930s studying Gallipoli, studying every failed landing in military history, and building a doctrine specifically designed to solve problems that the military establishment had concluded were unsolvable. They built specialized landing craft. They developed coordinated naval dumbfire support techniques. They trained for close-quarters combat in conditions other branches considered too extreme for realistic exercises. And then, in August of 1942, they tested all of it. Not in a laboratory, on Guadalcanal, against veterans of the conquest of China, while their own supply lines were being cut off behind them. The Japanese Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake commanded the 17th Army tasked with retaking Guadalcanal after Ichiki's disaster. He studied the reports carefully. He adjusted his assessment of the Marine defenders upward. And then he sent in 3,000 men under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi in a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously, timed for the night of the 12th of September 1942. It was, by any reasonable tactical standard, a better plan than Ichiki's frontal charge. It involved genuine coordination, genuine deception, genuine use of terrain. What it did not account for was the specific nature of the ground being assaulted, a ridgeline that would eventually bear the name of the Marine colonel who held it, and the specific nature of the men holding it. That ridge is worth describing, because the physical reality of what happened there is what Japanese survivors described with such consistency in their subsequent reports. It was a narrow spine of coral and kunai grass, 250 feet above the jungle floor. The Japanese would be attacking uphill, through jungle, at night, against Marines who had been digging defensive positions and stringing wire for 3 weeks. The Marines holding that ridge, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's battalion, together with the 1st Parachute Battalion, numbered roughly 800 men against Kawaguchi's 3,000. The assault that began around midnight was not one attack. It was wave after wave, each one absorbed, each one pushed back, each one costing the attackers more men than the defenders, across a night that lasted approximately 9 hours. A Japanese company commander, Captain Toshio Koyama, survived the assault. His account, given to military historians in 1958, contained a passage that was widely cited by American analysts. "I have tried many times to explain what it was like to attack that ridge. The Marines were not defending it, they were hunting us. We outnumbered them almost 4-1. We had surprise, we had the momentum of our charge, and still, every time we broke through, there were Marines behind the breakthrough, attacking into our flanks, as if the breakthrough was what they had been waiting for. They did not defend like men who were afraid. They fought like men who were angry. 3,000 Japanese soldiers, 800 Marines. After 9 hours of fighting, Kawaguchi had lost 1,200 men. Edson's battalion had lost 164 killed and wounded. The ridge held. The airstrip held. From that night, the strategic momentum had shifted, and the Japanese commanders who studied what had happened were left to grapple with a fundamental question: why? A Japanese intelligence report captured on Guadalcanal in late November of 1942 contained an assessment that was subsequently quoted in multiple American military after-action analyses. The Marine soldier is trained to use violence as a craftsman uses a tool, without passion, without hesitation, with adjustment for the specific task at hand. This is more dangerous than ferocity, because ferocity can be exhausted, and ferocity can be surprised. The craftsman cannot be surprised by his own work. That phrase, "cannot be surprised by his own work," points to something specific in Marine training philosophy that the Japanese were only now encountering directly. The Corps trained for scenarios of maximum disorganization. They trained for the situation in which everything has gone wrong. The officer is dead, the radio is destroyed, the flanks have collapsed, and the individual Marine must make immediate tactical decisions without guidance. The result was that individual Marines, at the squad and fire team level, were capable of tactical improvisation under pressure that consistently surprised Japanese commanders who expected a rigid, hierarchical response to disruption. On Cape Gloucester, in January of 1944, a Japanese battalion commander named Major Komori Yoshitaka was killed during a Marine assault on what his forces had designated as a prepared defensive strongpoint. His operations diary, recovered by Marine intelligence afterward, contained entries from the week preceding the assault that were notable for their analytical clarity. Writing on the 5th of January, Komori described watching a Marine patrol through binoculars. They move as a single organism but think as separate minds. When I watch them, I am reminded of the way a school of fish changes direction. No signal is given that I can see, yet all of them move together and correctly. I do not understand the mechanism. I am not certain it can be countered by our current dispositions. 3 days later, his dispositions were tested. They could not be countered. The Battle of Tarawa in November of 1943 represents a particular kind of test. The atoll of Betio had been described by its Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, with a confidence that was not entirely unjustified. Shibazaki reportedly told his garrison that the Americans could not take Betio with 1 million men in 100 years. The garrison he commanded numbered roughly 4,700 men in positions that included 14 coastal guns, 40 artillery pieces, and 500 machine gun nests connected by an elaborate trench and bunker system. The entire island was barely 2 miles long and barely 500 yards wide at its widest point. There was nowhere to land that was not covered by fire. The Marines landed on the 20th of November, 1943. They landed under fire that was immediately catastrophic. Landing craft grounded on a reef 500 yards from the beach, and the Marines crossed those 500 yards on foot in chest-deep water under direct fire from the positions on shore. The first wave suffered casualties that, in the opening hours of the assault, approached catastrophic levels. Communications broke down. Unit cohesion broke down, men were dying in the water in numbers that should have broken the assault. And still the Marines moved forward. Not in organized waves, those structures had been destroyed in the water. In ones and twos and small groups, individuals and remnants of squads, moving through the fire toward the beach for no reason that could be calculated, only trained. Shibazaki was killed on the first day. His command post was destroyed by naval gunfire. 76 hours after the first Marines set foot on that beach, Betio was secure. 4,590 Japanese soldiers were dead. 17 had surrendered. The Japanese officers who analyzed Tarawa after the war reached a conclusion that appeared in the official military history published in the 1960s. The Marines who crossed that reef did not do so because they were unaware of the danger. They did so because their training had given them the capacity to act correctly in situations where acting correctly required something beyond what normal men normally do. We had built our defense against the expectation of normal behavior. We had built the wrong defense. We had built the wrong defense. The phrase carries a weight that goes beyond tactical analysis. It reflects a fundamental miscalculation about what the United States Marine Corps had been built to do and what kind of men it had developed to do it. The Japanese military had built a doctrine around the principle that spiritual intensity could overcome material disadvantage. The Marines had built a doctrine around the principle that material, technical, and institutional excellence, applied with sufficient aggression by sufficiently prepared men, could overcome any defense that a human mind could construct. By 1945, the Japanese military was producing detailed analyses of American amphibious tactics that were, in their specificity and honesty, remarkable documents. A staff study prepared by the Imperial Japanese Army in February of 1945, captured at Okinawa and translated by American intelligence, contained a section on Marine Corps tactics that began with a sentence no Japanese military document would have contained 3 years earlier. The United States Marine Corps represents the most effective amphibious assault force yet developed in the history of warfare. Its effectiveness derives not from any single tactical innovation or any particular weapon system, but from the integration of selection, training, doctrine, and institutional memory that has produced individual soldiers capable of operating effectively under conditions of maximum uncertainty. No defense built around the expectation that these conditions will degrade their combat performance is a sound defense. The integration of selection, training, doctrine, and institutional memory. This is what Japanese intelligence analysts had identified after 3 years of being on the receiving end. Not a specific weapon. Not a specific tactic, a system. A system that had been built, refined, tested, and proven across decades of institutional self-examination, that produced men who were not simply brave, bravery being relatively common in war, but competent, competent in ways that compounded, that survived organizational disruption, that operated effectively at the individual level when all the structures above them had been destroyed. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945 is perhaps the most famous of the Pacific Marine campaigns. 22,000 Japanese defenders had spent 8 months constructing a defensive system. 16 miles of tunnels, dozens of blockhouses, hundreds of mutually supporting positions, specifically designed to maximize marine casualties. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had forbidden banzai charges. He had built a defense designed to kill Marines slowly, methodically, at maximum cost. He was right on both. The Marines took Iwo Jima in 36 days. They suffered approximately 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed. It was the only major Pacific battle in which American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. But they took it. Kuribayashi's finest defense had achieved maximum cost. It had not stopped them. A Japanese private named Hajime Kondo survived Iwo Jima in the tunnels and was captured in late March of 1945. His debriefing by American military intelligence was later declassified and published in a collection of Pacific War testimonials. Kondo was asked what distinguished the Marines from other forces he had encountered. He thought for a long time before answering. Then he said, "They do not seem to need an officer to tell them what to do. In our doctrine, the officer is the mind, and the soldiers are the body. Without the mind, the body does not know what to do. The Marines are different. Every man seems to carry a complete understanding of what needs to happen. When the officer falls, nothing changes. The attack continues in the same direction, with the same purpose, as if the officer was still there. We destroyed their structure, and the attack continued. We destroyed it again, and it continued again. In the end, we understood that there was no structure to destroy. The structure was inside each man. The structure was inside each man. This is perhaps the most precise summary, from an enemy perspective, of what Marine training had achieved: the decentralization of tactical competence, the embedding of institutional doctrine not in command hierarchy but in individual capability. The Marines had built an institution that could function, at the tactical level, without its own command structure. And the Japanese, who had built their military around the indispensability of the officer class, found themselves unable to construct a counter to something they had not anticipated and could not replicate. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, who commanded the defense of Peleliu in September of 1944, had studied every Marine campaign available to him, and had rebuilt Japanese defensive doctrine entirely around what he had learned. He abandoned banzai charges. He constructed cave systems, mutual fire support, defense in depth, a serious professional's response to a serious professional adversary. The 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu on the 15th of September. The operation had been projected to last 4 days. It lasted 73. Nakagawa's defense was the most sophisticated Japan had yet constructed. It inflicted proportionally among the highest casualties of the Pacific War on the Marines. And it still failed. When the island was finally secured, Nakagawa sent a final radio message, destroyed his regimental colors, and died with his remaining staff. His message was recovered and translated after the war. He said, "Our casualties are complete. We have done what could be done against this particular enemy. I want it recorded that the Marines fought as the legends said they would, which is to say, without stopping. I have no criticism of my men. I have no complaint about our tactics. They were simply better at this than we were. They were simply better at this than we were. There is no more honest assessment in the military record of the Pacific War." Nakagawa was not a man given to rhetorical flourishes. He was a professional evaluating a professional. And his conclusion, that the Marines had achieved a level of excellence in the specific discipline of island assault that could not be matched by even the most carefully prepared defense, was built on 2 years of evidence and study. The last word belongs to Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, who served as Chief Operations Officer for the defense of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, and who survived the battle, the only senior Japanese officer to do so. Yahara spent 3 months watching the 3rd and 6th Marine Divisions fight their way across Okinawa. He spent every one of those days trying to find something that would stop them. He found things that would slow them. He found things that would cost them dearly. He never found something that would stop them. Near the end of his memoir, published in Japan in 1972 and translated into English in 1995, he wrote, "I spent 3 months studying these men in combat. I observed them under every condition of stress, exhaustion, and adversity that a defender can impose. My conclusion, which I offer without pleasure, is that the United States Marine Corps in 1945 was the finest infantry assault force that has ever existed. Not the bravest. There have been brave armies throughout history. The finest. There is a difference. Bravery is what men bring to a battle. Fineness is what an institution builds over time and installs in its people so completely that they carry it into battle whether they feel brave or not. The Marines were fine. Fineness. The word is unusual in a military context, and Yahara intended it to carry its fullest weight. Not merely good, not merely effective, not merely brave. Fine in the sense of precision, of refinement, of something worked and reworked until the base material has become qualitatively different from what it began as. The United States Marine Corps that fought across the Pacific had been worked by 20 years of doctrine development, by the pressures of institutional survival, by the particular demands of the amphibious assault mission, by selection and training processes designed to produce men who could function at the tactical level without external support. The result was what Yahara observed and described, something that the most sophisticated military in Asia had spent 3 years trying to understand and counter, and had never fully succeeded in countering, because what the Marines had built was not a tactic or a weapon or a formation. It was a culture, embedded in people, portable to any beach, operational under any condition. The famous photograph from Iwo Jima, 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman raising the flag on Mount Suribachi on the 23rd of February 1945, became one of the defining images of the Second World War. It was spontaneous. It was real. It was taken during an ongoing battle on a volcano still controlled by Japanese forces in its tunnels and caves, while the men who raised the flag were under fire. 3 of the 6 men in that photograph were killed in the subsequent fighting. The image captured something true about the Marine experience in the Pacific, but perhaps not the thing it is usually taken to mean. It was not primarily about triumph. It was about men in the middle of a fight, doing a thing that needed to be done, in a place that was still trying to kill them, as if the fact of it trying to kill them was simply a condition to be managed, rather than a reason to stop. That is what the Japanese saw, across 3 years and dozens of islands, in the testimony that fills the archives and the memoirs and the intelligence reports. Men who treated being in places that were trying to kill them as simply a condition to be managed. Not men who were unafraid. Fear is biological, and the Marine Corps could not train it out of anyone. Men who had been prepared, at the deepest level of institutional formation, to act correctly in the presence of fear, to function through it, to carry the mission forward regardless of what the environment was doing to them. The Japanese called them devil dogs. They built their finest defenses against them and watched those defenses fail. And the honest ones, the professionals, the analysts, the men who wrote in diaries and memoirs and debriefing sessions what they had actually seen, said the same thing, in different words, across different islands, across different years. They said, "We have never seen anything like this before," and what they were describing was not a miracle, not a legend, not the product of some exceptional national character that could not be explained or replicated. They were describing the product of an institution that had spent 20 years solving a specific problem, and had solved it well enough that when the problem presented itself in reality, no one else on Earth was as prepared to handle it. That is the story the Japanese testimonials tell, not the story of superhuman warriors immune to fear and death, the story of an institution and what an institution can build when it knows precisely what it is building for, and takes the building seriously enough to do it right.